The year was 1945. The world was a theater of carnage, and behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was obsessed with a single biological problem: exhaustion. A soldier who needed sleep was a soldier who could be defeated. To solve this, a team of researchers devised a human experiment. They rounded up 5 political prisoners, men the state considered expendable, and offered them a deal that sounded like a miracle. If you can stay awake for 30 days using an experimental stimulant gas, you will be granted your total freedom. The men were ushered into a sealed chamber. The room was stocked with enough food and water for a month, a bathroom, books, and 5 cots. The researchers monitored them through 5-inch thick porthole windows and microphones hidden in the walls. For the first few days, the Nikolaev gas, a colorless, odorless stimulant, was pumped in. Everything seemed normal, until the clock hit 96 hours. Days 4 to 9, the curdling of the mind. By the 4th day, the polite conversation died. The prisoners stopped talking about their families or their hopes for life after the war. Instead, they began to recount their darkest, most traumatic memories. They spoke of the smell of gunpowder, the screams of the dying, and the sins they had committed to survive. By day 6, the camaraderie vanished entirely. A heavy, suffocating paranoia settled over the room. The men retreated to their own corners, refusing to look at one another. Occasionally, one would crawl to the microphones and begin to whisper. They weren't asking for food. They were whispering defenses of their comrades, betraying each other's secrets in the desperate, delusional hope that the researchers would reward them by letting them out early. The researchers watched, fascinated and repulsed. They didn't care about the betrayals. They simply watched the oxygen meters. The subjects were alive, and they were wide awake. Day 10, the screaming. On the morning of the 10th day, the silence was shattered. One of the subjects began to scream. He didn't stop. For 3 hours, he sprinted back and forth across the small chamber, howling at the top of his lungs until his face turned a bruised purple. Then, the sound changed. It wasn't a scream anymore. It was a series of wet, rhythmic squeaks. The researchers later realized the truth. The man had physically torn his vocal cords from the sheer intensity of his screaming. What was more terrifying than the man's injury was the reaction of the others, or rather, the lack of it. They didn't even look at him. While he squeaked and thrashed, 2 of the other subjects began tearing pages out of the books. They smeared the paper with their own waste and pressed the wet pages against the porthole windows, one by one, until the glass was completely obscured. Then, the chamber went dead silent. Days 11 to 14, the dead air. For 3 days, not a sound came from the room. No whispers, no squeaks, no footsteps. The researchers panicked. Was the gas lethal? Were they all dead? They checked the oxygen sensors. The levels indicated that all 5 men were still breathing. In fact, they were consuming oxygen at a rate usually reserved for athletes during heavy exercise. On the 14th day, desperate for a response, the researchers used the intercom. "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones," the voice boomed. "Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." A few seconds of static followed. Then, a voice came through the speaker, clear, calm, and bone-chilling. "We no longer want to be freed." The scientists were stunned. They debated for hours. Finally, at midnight on the 15th day, they made the decision. The experiment was over. At 12 a.m., the researchers shut off the flow of the stimulant gas and replaced it with fresh air. Immediately, the chamber erupted. The subjects began screaming, begging, and pleading not to be let out, but for the gas to be turned back on. They sounded like addicts in the throes of a terminal withdrawal. Ignoring the pleas, Soviet soldiers were sent in to extract them. They were not prepared for what they found. The room was flooded with 4 inches of murky, stagnant water. The drain in the center had been plugged with chunks of flesh, muscle and skin from the fifth subject, who was dead. The remaining 4 men were alive, but they were no longer human. Large sections of their own flesh had been ripped away from their chests and legs. It wasn't done with teeth, it was done by their own hands. They had disemboweled themselves, their internal organs visible through the gaping holes in their abdomens. Most horrifying of all, they were eating the flesh they had torn from their own bodies. The struggle to get them out was a massacre. One subject lunged at a soldier and bit through his neck, killing him instantly. Another subject's spleen ruptured during the fight. He bled out on the floor, yet he continued to scream and thrash for a full 3 minutes after his heart had stopped beating. The 3 remaining subjects were heavily restrained and rushed to a medical facility. The first was taken into surgery to have his organs replaced inside his body. When the doctors tried to administer a sedative, it had no effect. They gave him 10 times the lethal dose of morphine. He still fought, snapping the leather straps on the operating table like they were made of paper. He screamed for the gas. "I must remain awake," he shrieked. "I must stay awake." The moment they finally succeeded in administering a heavy anesthetic and he fell asleep, he died. His heart simply stopped. The second subject was the man who had torn his vocal cords. He couldn't scream, but he fought with a terrifying, silent intensity. He shook his head violently when they brought out the anesthesia. Like the first, as soon as his body finally succumbed to exhaustion and he drifted into unconsciousness, he flatlined. Only one subject remained. The scientists, terrified of another death, decided to hook him up to an EEG, electroencephalogram, to monitor his brainwaves. What they saw defied biology. Most of the time, the lines were normal, but every few minutes, the readout would inexplicably flatline, the signature of brain death, before jumping back to life. One researcher noticed that every time the subject's eyes closed for even a fraction of a second, a micro-sleep, the line went flat. He was literally dying every time he blinked. They tried to rush the gas back to him, but it was too late. His eyes closed one last time. The EEG showed a brief, deep sleep wave, then a final, flat line. He was gone. This story, known globally as the Russian sleep experiment, is a work of fiction, a creepypasta that took the internet by storm. There is no historical evidence that this specific study occurred. However, the reason it resonates so deeply is that the era it describes was very real. During World War II, horrific, unethical human experimentation was a reality. We still don't fully understand why we sleep, but we know what happens when we don't. That was only 3 days. Imagine 15 days. Imagine 30. The Russian sleep experiment may be a legend, but it taps into a primal truth. Our minds are held together by the fragile thread of rest. Without it, we don't just become tired, we become something else entirely.